Welcome to RHI's Sociable City Interviews, where we meet with global thought leaders on nightlife and the social economy. Today we are with John Stover, founder and managing partner with John Stover and Associates. Hey, John, great to see you today.
Great to be here.
Yeah, and everything going well in terms of, I heard you just had a baby and you struggling through COVID.
Yeah, we're making our way through something new every day.
All the challenges that come with that. Yeah, yeah. And you're in DC, kind of the center of a whole lot of stuff going on during this period of time. But I know that you've been, for many years, studying Main Streets and doing studies for the National Main Street Center, particularly around storefronts and economic and employment activity based on the retail sector in main streets. And of course, we're here mostly to talk about dining and entertainment or social venue activity as well. But how are you seeing trends in terms of the main streets that you studied? What were the major concerns or major opportunities that were emerging? I mean, not looking at just bad things, but also what were the opportunities emerging with retail, particularly with competition with online shopping, and what were Main Street's experience pre-COVID?
I've thought about that a lot too. You know, there were so many things that was a common talking point that I saw around the country, that I would speak to with clients and at panels, and I've been thinking about which of those trends have continued, and which do I think are likely to kind of take a turn given the pandemic. And I think there was a few, there maybe four kind of major trends that I used to speak to kind of leading up to COVID. One was the mass urbanization that we were seeing, and migration, where a lot of rural communities were struggling as folks were moving to more metropolitan areas, and then within metropolitan areas, more and more folks are moving to downtown, and it had all sorts of implications in terms of where there's a critical mass of spending, and where retail could thrive, and where entertainment venues were locating and thriving. Another trend was kind of the over retailed nature of the country. And if you look at how much square footage of retail space is there in the United States per person and compare that to anywhere else in the world, we have an incredible amount of retail space. And when you look at what was happening even before COVID with the traditional mall, and all the trends brought on by e-commerce, most folks really agreed that there needed to be some right sizing in terms of how much physical retail footprint we had in the country, and we were seeing the implications of that. And then third, a big trend in terms of what were we seeing in retail activity was this kind of bifurcation of what I like to call chore versus cherish. And other folks have talked about experiential retail being really strong, but businesses were doing well if they were either really oriented towards e-commerce, and that was especially the type of thing that you might call chore, where it wasn't a pleasurable experience buying, versus kind of that cherished experience of something that you really enjoyed doing, that type of shopping, so dining or socializing. Businesses were doing very well in that space. And then another trend that I think about was placemaking of the types of be it towns or destinations or neighborhoods that were doing well had a strong sense of place that people thought about, had a brand identity. You went to this place sometimes without even knowing exactly what type of activity you were going to engage in. But what made that possible was that it was aesthetically appealing, it was safe, and there was a lot to do in kind of a walkable climate.
What I hear you saying is that a lot of these main streets were really taking on the challenge of competition from online and retail, and those that survived, though that kind of made it out, were those that were creating opportunities that you couldn't get through these alternative ways. So that could be becoming more of a dining and entertainment center or more experiential shopping. So, by trying on clothes or experiencing and holding things or seeing art in person. So it was more the creativity sector of the retail economy, the kind of the creative economy, as well as the experiential. Is that what you're saying was kind of beginning to give opportunity and hope for main streets that were declining?
No, that's exactly right. And you were seeing you had to create this great experience for folks to come, especially in declining areas. But right on the experiential side, in terms of creativity, there was some brands emerging, such as Bonobos or Warby Parker, that were taking kind of traditional merchandise retail experience and kind of morphing that with an online experience where they didn't sell all of the merchandise in stock. You'd come in, see what you wanted, and then order online. What that allowed was smaller footprints, but still that kind of dynamic in-person experience, with the kind of economic value of e-commerce.
So moving on, after COVID, naturally, we all learned to create these own experiences in our home, buying more entertainment systems with big screens and better stereos. We took advantage of takeout or home delivery from our favorite restaurants. And in some ways, restaurants that might have had 100 or 200 seats become almost what would be called ghost kitchens, where,
Yeah.
are they going to begin to say, why do I need to maintain 100 seats when I can just have my food prepared and takeout, and I'll go buy a space in a little abandoned industrial center and not worry about having to pay the high rents of being downtown. I mean, those are the types of things that I'm thinking may end up becoming more popular or common. But what about the whole retail sector, which obviously we've learned even more so? I mean, we were primed before COVID to shop at home. But even after COVID, now even ordering toilet paper, became a part of the experience. So, what do you see happened with COVID, and how many of those changes will be temporary, and how many of them will become permanent? That we're not gonna have the downtowns anymore with people working at home and commercial office space, really in a decline, where you're not gonna have those workers that support that, weekday social experience? Will it just become weekends that people go downtown?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly what I've been trying to wrap my head around as well. And I think you hit the nail on the head, where one of the biggest impacts, not just on retail and entertainment, but I think it's going to impact tax bases and city policy and socialization and so many different things, is that I think we can expect a certain more amount of people to be telecommuting and to be commuting downtown less frequently. And that has impacts on transit and public transit and ridership and financial feasibility. That has impact on land value in terms of how much square footage of office space you need to lease, and the number, and less office workers downtown means less support for downtown businesses. That also means less necessity for folks to necessarily live as close to downtown or office centers. And so when I kind of think back to that trend leading up to the pandemic, where for 30 years, everybody in economics and demographics and policy was talking about this shift of urban migration. I think that the pendulum has started to shift, and the data is starting to bear this out. And I think that it's not just a blip in COVID, but we're going to see more people, because of these trends and these reasons, continuing to live in different types of places. And again, really massive implications in terms of land values, transportation, where folks may want to locate a new business, where folks may want to develop new housing. In terms of some of the other trends, thinking about the over retailed nature of the United States. Well, I think that's just even more exacerbated now with the larger share of e-commerce, and that kind of concept of the bifurcation of chore versus cherish retail is going to be just as important coming out of the pandemic. And placemaking, I think, is just as important as pre-pandemic as well. So even though folks may start valuing other types of experiences or physical locations, it's still about where's a great walkable place to go where you can experience all the different types of things that that someone wants to experience.
Well, this kind of ties into the next question, is how can a city monitor their patterns, and so then how can they use data more effectively to see that happening. So, obviously, during this period of time, in order to help the restaurants, many cities created streeteries, as they're called in New York, or they've closed the streets, or they've taken over parking lanes. So that restaurants can open up the outdoor cafes and the experiences there. And there's probably a good likelihood that even with vaccines, people will still be leery about coming out and getting into large crowds. So, we've learned to avoid people, so psychologically we may be uncomfortable getting into a crowded club or restaurant or big festival. But as we begin to move in that direction, this kind of reinforces the whole let's eliminate cars from cities and downtowns. And, do you think that that whole kind of day life is going to become as much a factor that people don't have to work 9 to 5? They could work whatever schedule they want, and they'll just go out and socialize or have a concert in the afternoon instead of waiting for the weekend. I mean, do you think there'll be kind of a permanence to this? And how would a city? I know that you just recently completed a study for DC, one of the neighborhoods there, and you have so many sources of data that people who know what they're doing can access, whether it be cell phone data to monitor how people are moving in a district, or ride share data to see where people are getting their Ubers and Lyfts and where they're picking them up and where they're being dropped off, as well as sales data that's coming through, your Visa, MasterCard, American Express documentation. So you've got a rich source of data that never existed before. People used to have to use green sheets to record information, but now you can access so much. But what would you see as the top indicators that people should be looking for to say, maybe we need to not really encourage more commercial, or maybe residential's not the pick, or maybe we need to designate areas, close the streets, and make them more of a social living room for the community? I mean, how do people and city officials begin to use data more effectively?
Yeah. You touched on so many interesting things in that question. I feel like that could have been an hour conversation between us on a number of those things. But I'll jump I'll stick to the data part of it. Though I'm tempted, real quick. I think that cars are actually, somewhat unfortunately, going to be even more more of a necessity in certain areas than public transit, given less kind of commuters coming in, and almost less value of transit-oriented living. And somewhat unfortunately, I come from a planning background, and it's a little bit to my chagrin. I also think that there's been a lot of value. I think that people's work hours, a lot of people are looking for some more normalcy and of working together. And I think that to some extent, post-pandemic, that kind of typical work time period, my just kind of shot in the dark guess is will still normalize, but there's some really innovative things that people are doing in that space. In terms of the data and metrics, that's always the basis of any of our analyses, and something that is pretty independent of the pandemic, but happened to coincide timing wise, is that there's a couple new data sources that existed for the last few years, but not in any kind of way that was usable or financially cost effective for most folks, that have really become widespread in their availability. And that is credit card data of transactions at businesses, and phone GPS data. And that, as someone who used to get a lot of data from intercept surveys, you would interview people on the streets, ask them to do a survey of where did you come from, where are you going, where are you spending your money, how much are you spending. That was somewhat mediocre data and pretty costly to execute. But that was the core information in terms of understanding customer bases and where people are coming, where should you market. And that's a little bit starting to go out the window with credit card data and phone GPS data, where you can actually understand and track flows of people in different areas, where they're coming from, what type of businesses do they go from, and what kind of business activity leads to other types of business activity. And then on the credit card data front, it's kind of exciting for someone like myself who's dabbling in this and seeing just how much this influences our work and the level of specificity of our recommendations that we're able to make. But we can track at a hyper local level how sales are changing, how transactions are changing, and how they're changing by particular business sectors, and also by customer base types. And the implications of this are pretty massive in that you can tell, when I think in terms of a market analysis, who are the customer bases that either a particular establishment or a particular district are appealing towards. Are you appealing towards your local residents? Are you appealing towards destination visitors? Are you appealing towards tourists? Or how much of your traffic is or your sales are coming from employees and office workforce? And so what you can do is say, okay, well, for example, the neighborhoods that we've seen do the worst in terms of retail activity and nightlife activity are areas that our largest portion of their customer base are tourists and office workers, because that hasn't existed at all. And so those businesses are receiving very little revenue. The types of businesses that are doing better are those that relied largely on local serving residential activity. And some of those districts are even doing better. And certain businesses that you wouldn't expect are doing even better during COVID because there's so much more customer base around to serve them. And so what this data shows is not only what types of places are doing better or worse, what types of businesses in those places are doing better or worse, and how those customer bases changed at a very micro level. But then you can start to make some projections moving forward too of, okay, well, do we think, our population going up or down? Is that tourist draw just kind of a brief period of time, or is that here to stay? And is the office population, is that going to come back in full? And by kind of making projections, and you can make some pretty accurate projections in terms of these different types of customer bases, you can really start to understand what type of businesses can you expect to roar back, and what type of industries or businesses can you project, okay, we just have way too much oversupply. There's going to be just a certain number that are going to unfortunately not be able to survive.
There could be an opportunity then for planners when they begin to see the return of tourism and conventions and things that have been on hold, and will probably be on hold until 2022. As you begin to see, air travel go up, as you see big conventions coming back to town, as a city planner for those areas of the city that may have depended upon that population of consumers, many of those storefronts will be closed and sometimes vacant. Do you think that's an opportunity for cities to say, well, let's refigure and calculate where we want this type of social activity, so we design it to be less conflicting with the residential development, that they could have almost like a clean slate to designate areas for the revitalization?
Yeah, I think so. And that's something we're working with a number of cities, and I won't name names, but of to some extent, zoning and certainly certain policy measures really have to change, where the assumption was mandate a lot of ground floor retail. And that paradigm, we're a little over retailed, and it makes sense from a walkability and vibrancy vantage point. That's not where the future is headed. And so I think that both in terms of encouraging the built environment moving forward, we need to be more strategic about where we placing, and especially where are we mandating traditional retail activity. But then there's a lot of implications in terms of vacant spaces too. And there's so many interesting things being done around the country in terms of vacant space activation and pop-ups and creative uses and affordable retail spaces and things like that. I think that there's going to be more opportunity to be creative than ever before. And how do we reimagine, how are we going to use spaces, especially if there's higher vacancy rates than we've seen in retail and office spaces, and especially spaces that can't easily be converted to other uses such as residential.
So 18 months from now, if I come to DC and we go on a little tour of Adams Morgan and Mount Pleasant and Georgetown and the Warehouse District and Barrack Row and all of those places that were hopping and growing and whatever, 18 months from now, what is it that you think we're going to see as we travel around in terms of how people are socializing and which areas are going to make it?
Well, you happen to, I think we're currently working in every single one of those neighborhoods. So that's an easier question than I was expecting. So I'll stick to what we're working currently with the Georgetown Business Improvement District, and they are undertaking a very comprehensive sidewalk expansion effort. And it's a pilot program that's going to be implemented starting in just a couple months, and then going through the next couple of years. But they're going to evaluate, is this something that we want to be permanent? And so we're working with them to kind of track how is this impacting and changing customer base, how is this helping or not the businesses, what does this mean in terms of transportation and other aspects. And I think that, there's so much of the future relating to retail and entertainment that I really have no idea where things are headed, but there's certain indications and signs in terms of where has investment gone, that is going to have impacts multiple years out. And so the sidewalk seating, the cities being more open to creative permitting and outdoor seating and things like that are things that we'll continue to see more of in the upcoming years. And it's pretty exciting in terms of that interplay of what used to be public space and what was private space, and that's starting to kind of merge together where cities are allowing private entertainment and recreational and dining uses on public spaces, and I think there's more of that, and it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out.
We should expect to see more expanded sidewalks, more outdoor cafe seating, more restricted transportation, more dedicated areas for pickup of takeout food and other types of things that we need to consider. Well, this has been a great conversation, John. I appreciate you taking the time. Obviously, you're always in the forefront of what's happening in this world, and we look forward to continuing to work with you.
Yeah, well, same here. I'm looking forward to the summit.
Okay, well, thanks a lot.
All right, take care, Jim.